you don't know me, my name's Lottie, I'm an actor, and I have made videos going through all of Shakespeare's comedies, all of Shakespeare's tragedies, and also all of Christopher Marlowe's plays, because I was someone who liked Shakespeare until I spoke to someone else who liked Shakespeare, because then I'd realise that like I didn't know any of the plays that they knew, and then I'd feel alienated from the whole idea of Shakespeare, and I'd just sort of back away from the idea of liking Shakespeare and feel really invalidated by the whole experience because I wasn't able to discuss any plays in common with anyone else. So instead of just like working on my self-esteem in that kind of aspect and giving myself that validation that it's okay if you don't know all the plays, which in reality it is because there's many plays, I took it upon myself to actually just go through the whole of the first folio, like basically the book that has a contents of like all of Shakespeare's plays. I've been going through all of it. And with the histories, I feel like, to be honest, this is one that I felt more wary to approach, because I don't know, I feel like there's more variety with comedies, and all you sort of need to be able to do is understand the story. But the histories are based on history, so I feel like, I fear they're more like sort of intellectual, like it's a commentary on history that I don't know about, because like I think the history, obviously it was more recent then to the Shakespearean time, so maybe it was more familiar to them, because it's like us sort of doing plays. I think about like World War II, World War I, Victorian times, but like I don't massively know the history leading up to Shakespeare in that much depth, and I fear that may be a barrier to entry, but maybe not, and I'm going to help us tackle the histories together. That's what I'm here to do. And I was looking into them, and they're actually considered to be like two sets of tetralogies. I can't even speak. This is going off to a great start, but like tetralogies, I've heard that's like the version of trilogies, but when there's 4 of them, and there are 2 sets of those, so 8 out of the 10 plays are in tetralogies. So there's one set of 4 plays about the War of the Roses, and there's one set of 4 plays about I don't know what it's about, but it's called the Henriad, and I was like, wait, but there's a Henry play that's like one of the 2 that's not in the tetralogies, and then I realised that like 3 of the plays in the other tetralogy also have Henry in them, and then I counted and I realised that out of the 10 histories, 7 of them have Henry in the title, which is mad, and I started to think maybe they're all sort of the same, but then I thought like just because someone's called Henry and someone else is called Henry, that doesn't automatically make them identical and make any plays about them exactly the same. Like I think that's some kind of internal prejudice I have to deal with. But like there's 7 plays with Henry in the title. Some of them are multiple parts about the same Henry, some of them are individual parts. Like the ones that aren't in the tetralogies are King John, which is historically before all of the other histories, and then there's one after as well, Henry VIII, which is interesting because there's sort of a chronological order that you can approach the histories in, because it's history, and it's all sort of about monarchs of English history. Like, there are other plays within the tragedies that are historical, but they're like historical Roman, like Greek, Egyptian, like Antony and Cleopatra, and like that kind of thing, Julius Caesar. There are quite a few historical ones, but this is specifically more recent English history to do with monarchs, and people sort of say that it was potentially political propaganda, because the monarchs of the time during Shakespeare's time were very much like theatre goers. They'd go watch stuff, so you sort of have to keep in with the monarch and stuff. So like it's very much like an adaptation of history to please whatever political situation was going on at the time, because there'd be like the normal like everyday people going to watch these plays, but also like really high members of society and like really powerful people going to watch the plays as well. So it's interesting, and I fear it will be complicated to access because there's all these different layers to it, but I'm hoping it will be fine. But there are 7 plays with Henry in the title, 2 with Richard in the title, and 1 with John in the title, which is mad. Like, when does being called John make you incredibly unique? Never in any other world or any other situation would John be a unique quality to have, but that is that. It's a lot of plays with quite monotonous titles, and I think actually though they are quite different in contents. Like, I know that there are some beautiful speeches. The stakes are so high in all of these plays because you've got wars, you've got people who have so much power, so then they therefore have so much to lose. There's romance, so I feel like they could actually be quite varied, but I just fear that I will get a bit lost and not feel the variation of it because 7 of them have Henry in the title, and I feel like I just need to get over myself with that kind of aspect and that kind of mental blockage. But I feel like it will be interesting because with the tetralogies, I've heard that like repertory companies would sometimes perform them in sequence, so they do like a season of like performing like one of them and then the next one and the next one, and like there's multiple characters in common sometimes because you could go through monarchs quite quickly, and obviously like not everyone's necessarily like dead just because you got a new monarch. So like it's interesting that they were able to cast the same people to play the same character in all of the different plays. So that's really interesting creative element to it. And I do get scared when there's like sequels of classical text because I feel like then maybe it will be harder to understand, but we're gonna find out, and you're gonna find out too because you're gonna be watching with me. So please subscribe because I'm scared because I fear that this will be harder to do. But I do actually know 2 of these plays already. I know King John and Henry V, and I do really like them, so I feel like maybe this will be my favourite set of Shakespearean plays so far. So with that, let me introduce you to Shakespeare's Histories. So King John was actually lent to me on DVD by a friend I have who absolutely raves about the RSC production of it, for the fact that there's a female King John and also the movement in it, like there's dance elements, and the movement director, I can't remember the name of the movement director in this, but is incredible and brings such a unique, fun energy to this piece. Like, it's really good, and it's interesting to reflect on that because those are 2 elements that are not actually in the script of King John, but they really elevate the performance. And also there were people in it with like Manchester accents, and like being able to bring in like modern references and stuff like that really brings it to life, because I feel like that would sell King John a bit more as well, because King John is widely considered to be one of the less performed and less popular plays, I think, because it's considered to be a bit disjointed or something. Like, also the King John is a bit harsh, like he kills or tries to get killed. He doesn't personally do it, like a lot of these characters don't, but sends people to kill his young nephew, which isn't nice, obviously. And like with some of these plays like Coriolanus, and also in the second part of Marlowe's Tamburlaine, these kind of characters can become a bit dislikable, and as a result of that people don't connect with them, and then people don't perform them because people can't connect with them. I don't know, but it's all about trying to stay in power because the French are fighting. There's stuff to do with like the Pope as well and all of the Pope's people, and arguments over legitimacy. And if you don't mind the spoiler as well that I'm about to give you, then King John dies at the end. I just find it a bit more complicated to understand with all of the different relations to all the different people and who's being considered to be illegitimate and all of that. Like, I find it a bit challenging. So Richard II is one of, I think, 4 of Shakespeare's plays that are written entirely in verse. I think they're all actually in the histories, which I never knew before. King John is entirely in verse, and also I think it's Henry VI, part 1 and 3, not part 2. I don't know what goes on there, we're going to find out. But also Richard II is a lot in rhyme as well, and a lot in like long speeches where Richard is talking about his thoughts in big philosophical senses, using big analogies. He often also, like in conversation with people, in one scene he's got like some next god complex. He's like, oh, you're like Pontius Pilate. He's like, these are the Judases, like, because he's feeling betrayed. And I'm like, that's mad. Like, why has this man got god complex for? Like, what's going on? But it feels so elevated because everything's in verse, which is the potential to like, it has the potential to feel really deep and really emotional, because the language is so heightened and so beautiful. Like, it's a beautifully written piece of art, really. So there's so much potential with the verse, and I think we often have some kind of weird feelings about verse as well in these kind of texts, that you have to say it in a certain sort of like traditional way. But I think actually verse these days can be interpreted so differently. Like, verse these days, there's like lots of different art, like rap and stuff, that's in verse. So I think we can still use that in a way that means something to people today as well. I'm not saying that like normal traditional Shakespeare doesn't mean anything to anyone, but like, you know what I mean, there's a wide variety of different ways you can use such elevated text. But I think because it's so extreme and it's so elevated, there's the potential to find comedic value in it as well, if you wanted to play it that way, because he's a bit of a silly guy at points. I think he sounds a bit silly, because basically he has 12,000 men who are loyal to him. He's the king, and then he returns to his country, and like everyone's allegiances have sort of changed. He sort of loses his power over the course of the play and has to hand the crown over, and it's sort of him dealing with that identity shift. Like, it's almost, it feels a bit like it could be like almost a breakup. Like, he was with these people and they used to look at him differently, and then he's returning and like everyone looks at him differently, everyone treats him differently. They used to call him king and now they call him Richard, which I think is quite funny, like them first naming the king like that, like crazy. I think it's funny. It feels like when you first name a teacher or something, like, I think that's fun, but maybe it's meant to be really serious and I'm just not taking it seriously enough. But also, this guy, Henry, who's taken over, he's using Richard's horse, and Richard's like, oh, like, this horse was so proud to be fed from my royal hand. He should be killing that man, throwing him off, breaking his neck. Why is this horse not respect me? And I'm like, this guy's insane. I'm like, there's so much comedy to be found in like how elevated he is, with also like, they keep saying goodbye to each other, does Richard and the Queen, and he's like, let's just say goodbye one more time and let our sorrows say the rest. And I'm like, he's so dramatic. I love it. I actually love it. I feel like we also don't really realise that there's actually lots of modern references that we can understand. Like, I think there's some people being like, oh, we're not going to get a holiday in a while. Like, that's relatable to people today. So I feel like there's lots of different ways that we could actually connect with this, despite it being a history and feeling on like first instinct like it could be quite far away from our lives. And the fact that he had everything and he was king, and then he's having to learn how to like kneel to other people, and he's like dealing with that identity shift, is relatable to many different people in many different contexts. And I think it's a really interesting thing to explore. And I actually have seen a monologue explored in a video by John Windsor Cunningham on YouTube, and I feel like that was really interesting as well to see it explored and performed. And there are such great monologues in this because it's all in verse and it's all so heightened and so dramatic, and each quote from this is so powerful as a statement and stunning writing. Like, I think it is one of my favourites. So I have watched Henry IV Part 1 through this series I've found, I think it's from the 60s, called An Age of Kings, and it takes you through in episodes gradually through all of the 8 sequential history plays. So from Richard II, maybe it will be, to, I don't know, but like there's a sequence of 8 of them, and I find it all a bit confusing. Hopefully I'll get to know the order a bit better, but it takes you through 8 of the plays in order. So that was interesting to be able to watch it. And what a lot of people have said, I found this watching it at the start, and a lot of people have said this online, is that like it's one of the less accessible plays, like especially at the start. It's hard to understand. There's like, it's hard to even pinpoint why it's hard to understand, but like compared to some of the other plays, this one's a bit less accessible, maybe because there's like less action and it's more like chatting, like banter and all of that, and like that's often harder to understand sometimes. But also it's not at all what you'd expect from a history, because you expect everything in Shakespeare, often people think, is very like highbrow and like formal, but a large portion of this is surrounding the British pub culture, which I feel like it's not even changed that much since Shakespeare's day. There's a lot of scenes that's just like pub banter, and I feel like some of the pub banter that's going on is a bit like, oh, like they probably did say this in a pub, but like body shaming this guy Falstaff. Falstaff's in this one, part 1, part 2, Henry V, and also the Merry Wives of Windsor. So he's in a lot of plays and he's a famous Shakespearean character, very like old and comedic, like he acts all like a certain way, but really it's all some big bravado kind of thing, I think. And like he fakes his own death because actually he's a bit of a coward. But some of the pub banter features include being like, oh, when was the last time you saw your knees? Like weight comments a lot, comments about people's appearance. And also there was one about like, oh, when you fix your face, I'll fix my life kind of vibe. It was obviously like using more Shakespearean verbs, but that was basically what it was. So it's not what people think Shakespeare is, but then also like he is known for quite witty insults and stuff, so it's very much that kind of play. And also there are speeches from women, which is nice because I feel like I'm realizing that like women aren't featured so much in the histories because they're not often monarchs. So it's nice to have Lady Percy having speeches. I think she's got speeches in the next one as well. And also there's a Welsh woman, and I think she just speaks Welsh. And I'm trying to understand if like the actual text is written in Welsh or if it just says like speaks Welsh and then like adaptations have written Welsh lines in. So I've heard that Henry IV Part 1 is really quite popular, and then lots of people don't like Henry IV Part 2. They feel like it's a lot of filler, and also Falstaff was clearly a very popular audience favourite. So Part 2 just seems to be what people describe as like fan fiction for Falstaff and like trying to sell that to the audience. So a large portion of the middle section is just sort of Falstaff and his life and sort of sketches about him, like Falstaff and his dramas at the brothel, Falstaff recruiting new soldiers. Like it's not all what you'd expect from a serious drama and history play from Shakespeare, but it's interesting. It's got something a bit different to it. And there's also a child character in this one, which I feel like we don't always see that many child characters with like actual lines in Shakespeare, now I think about it. And it has a famous female speech as well, oh yeah, for God's sake, go not to these wars, because I think that's more notable because women are very few and far between in the history plays because it's a lot about war and like the women aren't really there. I think that is some furthering of the plot because they have to bridge the gap between Henry IV Part 1 and Henry V, where Henry V is crowned, and the king, he thinks he's dead, and he takes the crown, and actually he's not dead, and then he's alive, and then immediately, like, quite soon after, he is genuinely dead. So I don't quite understand what's going on there, like, why is he coming back to life, only to die, like, a bit after, but I think it's sort of, like, relationship fixing kind of drama. But it is interesting because like there is certain elements surrounding the politics in order to further the plot along, but it is very much like playing to the crowd like a lot of Falstaff, because theatre is a business and we need to sell tickets, so it feels, people think it's very commercialised, but I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing because the characters are already established in Henry IV Part 1, so being able to like have a bit of fun with it now everyone understands it would be fun to be able to put the parts together, but I think often it's just like not really that present in theatre anymore, like we don't really use it that much. So I'd argue that Henry V is potentially the most known of the history plays, and I've actually seen it well before doing this. I saw it a while ago. It was how one year I welcomed in the new year as I ended up watching Henry V with my family, which sounds pretty rogue actually. Like, I have lived New Year in a variety of different ways, but that was one year, and I feel like it was quite a powerful way to bring in the new year because the speeches are beautiful, the language is so powerful, and there's such a range of different elements to it because there's battle speeches, there's like war, there's romance, and there's like such an energy to it, which is really exciting to watch. And there's also speeches from the chorus, which is basically sort of like narration, like it introduces the play with like "Oh from Muse of Fire" speech, which is really famous, and there's a lot of famous battle speeches in this. And I think the narration and introduction to the play makes it feel so like powerful, and it really paints the scene. And I feel like there's a lot of films been made from this, and a lot of famous actors have performed this because it feels so powerful and grand as a story. So I think that's what I really took away from watching it, which I think is why some of the other plays have surprised me a bit, because it's more, even though it is a history and it's about like monarchs and stuff, it does just feel more domestic and comedic, whereas this feels like a grand story. So after reading Henry VI Part 1, I thought I should look it up just to see like if I've missed anything, because I'm just going off my own instincts, and I'm just a girl who's read some Shakespeare, and I feel like the experts sometimes surprise you with what they say. And apparently this play is considered to be badly written, it's considered to have like a disjointed storyline, and lots of people think it actually wasn't written by Shakespeare because it's not good and it's one of the worst plays, along with Titus Andronicus is what it says on Wikipedia. But I don't think Titus Andronicus is that bad. I think there are worse plays that Shakespeare has written than this and Titus Andronicus, but that's just me. But it's interesting to see that, and it's very interesting as a play because it's centered more around the sort of France storyline of the England-France conflict, and Joan of Arc's in it. And I don't know much about Joan of Arc, I've just heard of her as a figure, but she has some like spiritual connections, and like as a woman who hasn't slept with any men, she's like pure, so she can like have this spiritual connection and be able to like influence the strategy of the war, because it's a lot to do with the strategy of like England versus France, and it's very like much based in strategy as a storyline, like strategizing a war. And Joan is an interesting character because it's interesting in a historical play that a woman has so much power over the strategy in a war, but it's obviously to do with like her connections spiritually and all of that. I don't know if it's like Catholic or if it's like something else, but basically like she then ends up like getting captured, and they think that she's some next like sorceress kind of like toxic woman, and then she tries to claim being pregnant to avoid getting burned at the stake, and then they're like, oh, like you're not a pure woman, like you've been with like men, and then she's naming all of these different potential fathers to try and get out of like being burnt at the stake, and she also denies her own father, and she's like, no, I've got a more noble birth, like you can't burn me at the stake. And I think there could be many different interesting interpretations of this, like adaptations of this play. All she's done is like strategize a war and be involved in a war like all the other men are, but like being a woman and having spiritual connections, I think is different, because then they're like witch, like that's what a lot of people were like historically. So it's an interesting story, and it's interesting to present experiences that women historically have gone through. And there's also a really interesting scene with a father and a son, because obviously the father will have a higher status, being older and like being more well connected and stuff, but the son is the bloodline. So it's interesting to see that sort of debate about like who will have more risks and like risk their life more in war, because they're suggesting that like one of them should leave and survive and live on. And then there's the shame of looking like a coward and like running off as a young man who should be like fit and fighting in wars. So it's really interesting to see that versus like protecting status and all of that kind of like status, youth, bloodline sort of debate, and like how you appear to other people through that as a man in society, and like what should a man be and what's the best option for them as men in order to present better to people, like what outcome looks best and reflects best on both of them, which is interesting. Like I feel like it's an interesting sort of topic to explore, and especially looking back on it, like we have different ideas of like expectations on men, so it would be interesting to look at in a performance angle. So in Henry VI Part 2, what surprised me is that I feel like I've been shouting out every time there's been like a tiny cameo from a woman, but actually there's the Duchess and the Queen in this that are both women, obviously, and they actually have a lot more power in that they know their own mind, they're involved consistently in like following their own trajectory and their own version of like what they think is right, and like doing what they want, basically. Like they feel like they have a lot more freedom and a lot more like purpose and involvement in the actual direction of the plot, which is nice and interesting to see. And the female characters are also so sort of independent from the male narrative that actually the Queen is sort of openly flirting with another man, and I'm like, is this okay? Like, what's the etiquette for this? Like, obviously I'm not saying that like there's a world in which it is necessarily okay, but I'm like, how is she getting away with like openly liking this guy Suffolk? I don't know if he's like Duke of Suffolk, Earl of Suffolk, some kind of title from Suffolk, and I'm like, why? How? Like, it's very explicitly flirting, and then he gets beheaded, and then she's like so upset, and the king's like, you wouldn't have been this upset if it was me dead. And then she sort of tries to cover that and be like, oh, like I would have died from the sadness if like it was you, but like it seems like she really likes this guy who's not the king, and I'm like, surely that would get you into a lot of trouble. So I don't really know how she's getting away with that. I don't quite understand that plot point. And also, to be honest, what very much terrified me from the very start of looking at the contents page was Act 4, because like, why are there 10 scenes? 10 scenes, 10 scenes. And I was like, it's gonna take me forever to read it, like it's gonna be really challenging, but actually some of the scenes are quite short. And what surprised me and stood out to me about Act 4 is that it's telling stories and like narratives of like your normal everyday people, and it made me realize that throughout the rest of the history so far it's very much like been stories of the aristocracy and the people with the most money and the most titles. But it's interesting to see these everyday people who are like, we deserve as much right to have power and control over our country. And like there's certain parts that I like agree with or think is like a nice insight. Like some people, there's a mention of the fact that like not everyone will know how to write their name, because not everyone's literate. And also they're painting this idea of this sort of utopian society where everyone can live in my kingdom and not have to work and live like my brothers in the society, and like we can have fountains of wine. And I'm like, sounds great. And then they start to like be very anti-lawyer. Like I think it's quite a famous Shakespearean line. I've sort of heard of it in passing, and it's nice to know sometimes where some of the famous references come from. And there's a line, letters kill all lawyers, or something like that, and it's a very anti-lawyer time apparently in Shakespeare, because like they had a lot of power and people thought that they wouldn't necessarily be behaving in an ethical way, but behaving in a way that will get them the most money. So it's interesting to see that sort of pro-working man, anti-aristocracy narrative. However, some of these leaders are like a bit questionable in their opinions. Like they're also like, I want to sleep with every man's wife before he sleeps with them, la, la, la. Like that's a bit, I don't that's wrong, obviously. And there's chat about like, oh, like, I think that like if this happens, like, assault their wives and daughters, and I'm like, don't be doing that. And also something that I noticed in this play is that people are quite willing to openly express their desire to have people dead, to kill people, and people are coming face to face with like watching the process of death, which I think, to be fair, in like modern society, we've become quite disconnected on the whole from seeing the process of death, which is a normal part of the human experience. However, like, it's not socially acceptable to be saying like, I want to kill this person, I really want this person dead. I don't think that's really socially acceptable. I think that just stood out to me as a pattern of behavior that feels quite abnormal, and I don't know if that's what they were doing more back in the day because it was a way of gaining power and having control over the society, and there was more of like the death penalty and stuff, but it's something that just stood out to me. And also it ends on a cliffhanger because like this guy, York guy, is like trying to pursue the king. So I think that's interesting that it ends on a cliffhanger because it's like, do we present these three parts as individual pieces of work? Are they meant to be presented together, or are they meant to be merged together? Like, how do we perform them? Because I don't really see them out there that often. So I feel like part 3 is actually a pretty dramatic and underrated play, personally. And I read on Wikipedia actually that it's reportedly got more battle scenes than any other Shakespeare play because it's got 4 on-stage battles and 1 off-stage, which people therefore say potentially like it's not considered possible for this play to be considered high art because it's just sort of like appealing to the audiences through violence, which is like a cheap, easy way to get audience attention. But I think actually that's not the case, and it presents a more nuanced version of violence compared to like some of the other plays in this trilogy as well, because like in part 2, this guy Cade, he's beheaded 2 people and he's like, they loved each other so much during life, so let's make them kiss each other on every street corner because they love each other so much. And I'm like, that's a bit like mad as an image. But in this, there is a lot of chat about how many thousands of men are in each battle, which is quite intense to read, like 20,000 men, 3,000 men, like it's a lot of people, but it shows the scale of what's going on. And there is also a scene where this father is like taking the body of someone he's killed and he realizes that it's his son, and there's also a son who's taking the body of someone and realizes that it's his father. So it's about the fact that like we kill people during battle and we don't really know who they are, and we might actually be killing someone who could potentially be close to us. So I think that's actually quite a powerful sort of like thought to express in a play. And I think also throughout this trilogy there are children and like 12-year-olds also in the battle, like following the footsteps of their parents and getting killed because like the people killing them have a vendetta against their parents or whatever. And I think that's quite mad as a thought to know that that was going on. And obviously don't take this as me making any political points on the actual historical figures, I'm just making comments on the actual Shakespearean characters. But the plot of this, it's height of drama really, because King Henry VI, he is like spoken to by the Duke of York, and the Duke of York is like, I think actually my claim to the throne is stronger than yours. And Henry VI is like, yeah, fair enough, maybe it is, like, just let me live out my reign as king, and then after that I'll just disinherit all of my descendants and it can go to your line instead. And I think the Queen's a bit annoyed because she's like, you've just disinherited your son. And like, the King's fine though, like King Henry VI is like, that's fine, like there are more important things in life than being king. So then there's King Edward. He ends up, I can't really remember how, but he ends up being king, and Henry VI is in prison, so he's not really featured massively in this play. But Edward is like, why don't I like marry this French woman, because if I marry a French woman then we have that sort of allegiance with France and like we're all better protected. Like there's a lot of like political relationships that would go on back in the day. So Warwick is an ally and he's going over to France to like wingman his mate and like get the girl. So he's like, yeah, like he's really interested, blah, blah, blah. He finds her like really attractive, blah, 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 blah. And then a messenger comes and is like, yeah, he's married someone else. And then Warwick is fuming because obviously, imagine how humiliating that is. Like, you've travelled all the way to France to wingman the king, and then the king's married someone else. So, like, then he switches sides, but then in the end, like, he's wound everyone up because there's a lot of chat about like brotherhood and like, you don't do this to your brothers. Like, we could have married her, but like, you've married her instead, and you were meant to marry this French girl anyway, so why are you marrying her? And she's also not that interested. I think the dialogue is quite iconic as well. I've got it here because I just think the way that he hits on her and the way that she rejects him, like this is why people say Shakespeare supports women, because he says to her, to tell thee plain, I aim to lie with thee, and then she says, to tell you plain, I had rather lie in prison. And I'm like, oh, like that's so savage, like what a way to turn down a man. And then they end up like marrying in the end, but I think that's mad. Like, what a way to reject a man. I'd rather lie in prison. Like, what a line, what a line, what a line. But then in the end, like, he's wound everyone up because he's broken the brotherhood. Basically, it's all like sort of bro code stuff. They're like, why are you breaking this bro code? Like, they're not happy with him. And then they offer the crown back to Henry. And he's like, I'd rather just say my prayers, praise God, I think I have bad luck, so like I'll take the title of king, but please someone else do it, like the actual leading stuff. And then they reluctantly take the duty on board, but I think that's so iconic. Like, he just wants to read his book, genuinely just wants to read his book. He doesn't want to lead a country, he thinks he's got bad luck leading a country, and I think like he's such an iconic character. So Richard III is one of the longer plays, but as a result of that it's often abridged, and it's abridged by cutting out multiple characters, I think even, which means it's got a lot of different storylines. And to be honest, it's a play that I feel like I would need to look over it again in order to feel confident in my understanding of it, because it feels more complex to me personally. And it's got the famous speech, now is the winter of our discontent, in it. And also Richard III, if you don't know him, he was found in a Leicester car park, actually, the body of him. He is the famous king. I think he had scoliosis, but people say actually that like in Shakespeare's version he's very much vilified, and it's sort of political propaganda and more than anything, because that would be what would be the accepted version to put on stage with the current political situation, would be to vilify Richard III, which is interesting. And there's also more fictional elements in this. Like, it doesn't feel like it's a realistic portrayal of what happened, because there are ghosts at the end who are speaking to Richard in his sleep, and also to Richmond, who succeeds him, which is interesting because I didn't expect that sort of spiritual element to it, because I don't feel like that's so much part of the plot in many of these other historical dramas. So that's interesting to see. But like Richard, he's getting people killed, and he's also like treating women as disposable. Like, he's killed her husband, and then like when she's mourning him, like he's then trying to get with her, but like being like, oh, I won't stay with her that long, like blah, 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 blah. So he's meant to be like this villain, and like people play it really well. He's a really interesting character to approach, but it feels like quite a complex play for me personally. So I found this play Henry VIII really interesting because I feel like lots of people don't even know that Shakespeare has a play about Henry VIII. I believe like, even though it's a history play, I believe it's relatively recent history for Shakespeare, and I was a bit apprehensive going into reading this play because I thought it might potentially be like cancelled in the modern day, because we have six now, and that is putting the six queens, the six wives as the title, and like reclaiming power from the story, whereas this is named after Henry VIII. So I thought we're sort of like, yeah, it might not be like a play that stands up in the modern day, but actually, a lot of this story follows Catherine of Aragon, the first wife, and she really openly expresses her anger at like the fact that she has been honourable, she has been a good wife, and like she's being left, and why? And she's questioning it, and she's got some really powerful speeches, and I feel like a lot of people in that kind of situation, when they're being left for someone else, have the similar sort of thought process and speeches and conversations. So I think it's really powerful and relatable for people. And also, Anne is not really convinced about the idea of this leading to a happy ending for her either, so that is interesting to see that she's not really convinced about the idea from the very start. And it's nice to see that, like, even though it is called Henry VIII, a lot of it follows this cardinal and also Catherine of Aragon and their story and their thoughts. And it's different to some of the other histories because it's not so much like battle based. There isn't battles, it's more just like based around the court, and it's like the thoughts of the court, which is interesting to see. And there's a prologue, which is a beautiful speech at the start, which sort of dictates to the audience the emotional tone and what to expect from the play. And also there's a song in this, which is really interesting and really fun whenever there's a song in a play, I think. Also, something I feel like I should have mentioned in that clip but didn't, is that this play doesn't follow all of King Henry VIII's reign. I feel like his later part of his reign might have been a bit too tumultuous and recent, and like maybe it wasn't acceptable to make plays about that part. So this follows like the ending of the marriage with Catherine into the marriage with Anne Boleyn, so his first and second wife. So I've gone through all of Shakespeare's histories now, as well as previously the comedies and tragedies, so please do go check out those videos as well. But like, I've gone through the first folio now, which feels crazy, and I think the histories were actually a lot more distinct and different from each other than I originally thought, and it didn't feel too like distant from my own personal experience, because you can still relate to certain human emotions that they're going through. And also I think the comedy surprised me. Like, there's quite a lot of comedy in a lot of these plays, and that really keeps it feeling a lot more grounded and entertaining, actually. Like, I really liked some of these plays. So if you know any of these plays or like have any thoughts based on this, then please do let me know in the comments. And also, I'm sorry if I got anything wrong as well, because I feel like it is Shakespeare, so it is difficult, but I have shared to the best of my ability and explain stuff to the best of my ability, but it's difficult. And with regards to accessing the text, I feel like I've got a baseline in all of these plays, but there will be certain nuances with the plot and like elements of the language that I might only get if I like watched them again and studied them all in more detail, which I think is fair enough because it's quite challenging. But I thought I'd point that out. But I'm glad that I have a baseline knowledge in all of these plays, because as an actor, like, if I then got an audition for one of these plays, I can go back and reference my own resources that I've created, and I have like a first impression of the play already, which I think I've personally found really valuable. And I actually found it quite crazy making this video, because I was thinking this is some of the last times that I will experience seeing like a Shakespeare play for the first time, or reading a Shakespeare play for the first time, because I've gone through most of them. There are some that are like not in the first folio, weren't published in that, but are now attributed to Shakespeare, like Two Noble Kinsmen, which I actually do an audition speech from, but also Pericles and Edward III, so I could go through them at some point. And some of these plays are believed to have like collaborators and co-authors as well. Like I think John Fletcher is believed to have written quite a few of the scenes in Henry VIII, and also it's interesting to hear that like Henry VIII, like a cannon going off in Henry VIII is the reason why the original Shakespeare's Globe burnt down, which I think is an interesting fun fact to pop in the end of this video. And I feel like I will, after a bit of time, review my experience going through the first folio and like bring out even more like thoughts from it. So please do subscribe as well, and please do subscribe anyway, because it's a big task to go through all of the first folio, but I'm really glad that I did it. And let me know what you think about Shakespeare now. That's a bit of a big question, but I think it's really nice to be able to talk openly about Shakespeare and our thoughts about it. And thank you so much for sticking with me for this whole video. Thank you. Bye.